The morning began the way most mornings did in the town of Elmridge, without ceremony or announcement. There was no sound that declared its importance, no signal that would have caused anyone to pause or look more closely. The sun rose in its usual way, slowly and without urgency, lifting itself over the distant line of trees that marked the horizon. Its light moved carefully across the land, touching rooftops, sidewalks, and the quiet streets that had not yet fully awakened. For a few moments, the town existed in a space between night and day. Porch lights still glowed faintly, though they were no longer needed. The air carried the coolness of the night, and everything seemed to wait, as if unsure whether it was time to begin. Inside a modest white house near the center of town, Thomas Carter woke to the sound of his alarm clock. The sound was not loud, but it was persistent. It had rung at the same time every weekday morning for nearly 17 years. He reached over, his hand moving automatically, and turned it off before it could ring again. For a moment he remained still, staring at the ceiling, allowing himself the final seconds of stillness before the day began. There was nothing unusual about Thomas Carter. He was 42 years old with a job at the local manufacturing plant where he supervised a small section of the assembly floor. His hair had begun to thin, though he rarely thought about it. His life was defined not by dramatic moments, but by repetition. He woke at the same time, ate the same breakfast, and drove the same route to work. He sat up slowly, placing his feet on the wooden floor, which felt cool beneath his skin. The house was quiet. His wife, Margaret, would wake soon, but for now he was alone with the familiar silence of early morning. In the kitchen, the clock on the wall ticked steadily. Each second passed with quiet certainty, marking time in a way that felt both precise and indifferent. Thomas filled the coffee maker with water and grounds, performing the task without needing to think. The machine responded with a low, mechanical sound, beginning its work. Outside, the town was beginning to move. A single car drove down Maple Street, its tires making a soft sound against the pavement. A porch light flicked off. A curtain shifted as someone looked out, checking the sky, confirming that morning had arrived. At the edge of town, Daniel Reeves stepped out of his small apartment and locked the door behind him. He worked at the gas station on Route 14, opening it every morning at 6. He had done this for 3 years, and the routine had become part of him. He did not question it. He did not resent it. It was simply what he did. He walked to his car, an aging blue sedan that started with hesitation before settling into a steady idle. The engine's sound filled the quiet space, briefly interrupting the stillness. Elsewhere, in a house with faded yellow paint, Helen Morris stood at her kitchen window, watching the street. She held a cup of coffee in both hands, feeling its warmth. She had lived in this house for 38 years. She had watched neighbors come and go, watched children grow into adults and move away. The street looked the same, but she knew it was not. She did not think of this in terms of history. She did not think of herself as someone living through a significant period. She simply stood there, watching the morning. At 6:12 a.m., the first school bus entered the town. Its yellow surface reflected the early sunlight. It moved slowly, stopping at corners where children waited with backpacks that seemed slightly too large for their bodies. They climbed aboard without speaking much, still carrying the quiet of sleep. The bus driver, a man named Richard Holloway, had been driving the same route for 9 years. He knew every stop, every house. He knew which children would be waiting early and which would run at the last moment. He did not consider his work important in any grand sense. It was simply necessary. The town continued to wake in small, almost invisible ways. At 6:27 a.m., the door of Parker's Grocery opened. The owner, Samuel Parker, stepped inside and turned on the lights. The fluorescent bulbs flickered briefly before settling into a steady glow. He walked past the shelves, checking nothing in particular. The store smelled faintly of cardboard and cleaning solution. He had opened this store every morning for 22 years.
He did not think about the number of mornings. He did not count them. Each one existed on its own, separate and ordinary. Cars began to appear more frequently on the roads now. They moved with quiet purpose, carrying people toward places they had gone many times before. There was no excitement in these movements. There was only continuation. Thomas Carter finished his coffee and put on his jacket. Margaret had woken and now stood at the stove, preparing breakfast. They spoke briefly, exchanging familiar words that carried comfort not because of their content, but because of their consistency. "Cold this morning," she said. "Yeah," he replied. There was nothing more to add. He stepped outside at 6:43 a.m. The air was crisp, and he inhaled deeply without thinking about it. He walked to his car, opened the door, and sat down. The seat felt exactly as it always did. He started the engine. Across town, dozens of others did the same. Engines started, doors closed, tires rolled forward. None of these actions were remarkable. None of them would be remembered. And yet, together, they formed something larger than any individual moment. The factory where Thomas worked stood at the edge of Elm Ridge, a large rectangular building made of concrete and steel. It did not appear impressive. It had no architectural beauty. Its purpose was purely functional. Workers arrived in steady numbers, parking their cars in familiar spaces. They entered the building without hesitation, their movements guided by habit. Inside, machines waited. They would soon begin their work, producing parts that would be shipped elsewhere, assembled into larger products, and sent to places the workers might never see. Thomas entered through the side door, nodding briefly to a man he passed. They did not stop to talk. They did not need to. At 6:58 a.m., he reached his station. At exactly 7 a.m., the machine started. The sound filled the building, not suddenly, but completely. It became the environment, the constant presence against which everything else existed. Outside, the sun had risen fully now. The shadows had shortened. The town was no longer between night and day. It had entered morning completely. From a distance, Elm Ridge looked calm and unchanged. Its streets were orderly. Its buildings stood where they had always stood. Nothing about it suggested transformation. And yet, without anyone noticing, change was present. It existed in the repetition of routine, in the continuation of work, in the quiet persistence of ordinary life. The people of Elm Ridge did not think of themselves as participants in history. They did not imagine that their daily actions contributed to something larger. They simply lived. They woke up. They drank their coffee. They went to work. They repeated the same motions they had performed the day before and the day before that. But history was not only made in moments of conflict or discovery. It was made here, too, in the quiet consistency of ordinary mornings. It was made in the sound of alarm clocks and coffee makers, in the turning of keys and the opening of doors, in the movement of people who did not realize they were building the future simply by continuing forward. By 7:15 a.m., the town was fully awake. The spaces that had been empty were now occupied. The silence had been replaced by the low, steady sound of activity. Nothing about the morning demanded attention. Nothing about it asked to be remembered. And yet, it would matter. Not because it was different, but because it was not. Because it was one of thousands of mornings that together formed the foundation of something larger than anyone could see. A morning that looked like any other. And for that reason, it was part of everything that would come next.
By the time the clock reached 7:18 a.m., the streets of Elm Ridge had begun to fill in ways that no single person fully noticed. The change was gradual, almost careful, as if the town itself were stretching its limbs after sleep. What had been empty pavement only an hour before now carried motion. It carried purpose. It carried people who had somewhere to be, even if that place was the same one they had gone to for years. Main Street, which ran through the center of town like a quiet spine, held the first signs of this transition. A delivery truck turned slowly onto its worn asphalt, its engine humming with a steady patience. The driver, a man named Victor Alvarez, had been awake since before dawn. He had driven 80 miles already, carrying crates filled with packaged bread, canned goods, and cartons of milk. He stopped in front of Parker's Grocery and turned off the engine. The sudden silence was noticeable, though it lasted only a moment. He stepped down from the truck, his boots touching the pavement with a sound that seemed small in the open air. Samuel Parker was already waiting. Neither man spoke much. They had performed this exchange hundreds of times. Victor opened the back of the truck, and Samuel began lifting the crates, carrying them inside one by one. Each crate was not especially heavy. Each movement was not especially difficult, but together they formed part of a chain that extended far beyond Elmridge. The milk had been processed in another state. The bread had been baked in a factory hours away. The canned goods had traveled even farther. None of this was visible on the surface. To anyone passing by, it would appear to be nothing more than a delivery, but it was also the quiet movement of an economy that never fully stopped. Further down the street, the door of a small hardware store opened. Its owner, Charles Bennett, stepped outside holding a ring of keys. He unlocked the metal security gate and lifted it slowly. The sound of its movement echoed briefly before disappearing into the wider noise of the morning. Charles had owned the store for 19 years. He knew which customers would arrive early and which would come later. He knew which shelves needed restocking and which items would sit untouched for weeks. He turned on the lights inside and stood for a moment, looking at the familiar arrangement of tools and supplies. There was comfort in the repetition. There was certainty in knowing what the day would bring. Outside, a woman walked past carrying a leather bag over her shoulder. Her name was Patricia Klein, and she worked at the local bank. Her pace was steady, neither hurried nor slow. She walked this route every weekday, passing the same buildings, seeing the same faces. She did not think about the meaning of these movements. She did not think of them as part of something larger. They were simply her routine. At the intersection near the post office, a traffic light changed from red to green. Cars began to move forward, their engines creating a low, continuous sound. Each vehicle carried a person with a destination, a responsibility, a role. Some were factory workers, some were clerks, some delivering goods that would be used, sold, or consumed before the day ended. Together they formed a pattern that repeated itself with quiet consistency. A postal truck stopped at the curb, and the driver stepped out carrying a canvas bag filled with letters and envelopes. Each piece of mail represented communication between people who were not physically present with one another. Business contracts, personal letters, bills, notices. The driver placed them carefully into metal boxes one by one. This act, too, was ordinary, but it connected individuals across distances they could not see. By 7:42 a.m., the streets held more people than empty space. Footsteps overlapped, intersected, and passed one another without acknowledgement. Most people did not stop to talk. Most people did not pause long enough to notice anyone else. They were focused on continuation, on arriving, on beginning the work that waited for them. A bus moved slowly down Main Street, stopping to allow passengers to step off. Among them was a young man named Eric Lawson, who had moved to Elmridge only 6 months earlier. He was still unfamiliar with many of its rhythms, still adjusting to its pace. He stepped onto the sidewalk and looked briefly at the buildings around him. They did not appear remarkable, but they held opportunity. He walked toward the insurance office where he had recently begun working, carrying with him the quiet hope of stability. Nearby, a restaurant owner named Linda Grayson flipped the sign on her door from closed to open. Inside, the smell of coffee and cooking food began to fill the space. Within minutes, customers would arrive. They always did. Not because the restaurant was extraordinary, but because it was reliable. Reliability was one of the invisible foundations of the town. It existed in places that opened when expected, in services that were available when needed, in people who arrived on time. A construction truck passed slowly, carrying wooden beams and metal supports. These materials would soon become part of a new building at the edge of town. The building did not yet exist, but its future presence was already shaping the present. The workers who would assemble it were already awake, already moving, already part of the process. At 8:03 a.m., the streets had reached their fullest state of motion. Cars filled the lanes, sidewalks carried steady streams of movement. Storefronts stood open, ready to receive customers. Nothing about the scene suggested drama, nothing suggested history, and yet history was present, not in a single moment, but in accumulation, in the repetition of economic life, in the steady exchange of goods, services, and labor. Each delivery truck carried more than its cargo. It carried continuity. Each shop that opened its doors carried more than products. It carried participation in a system larger than itself. Each worker walking down the street carried more than their own purpose. They carried the quiet strength of a nation built not only on extraordinary events, but on ordinary days repeated without interruption. By mid-morning, some streets would empty again as people settled into their workplaces. The visible motion would decrease. The sidewalks would grow quieter, but the work would continue behind walls and inside buildings. Machines would operate, papers would be processed, phones would ring, transactions would occur. All of it would contribute to something that no single person could fully observe. The streets would remain. They would wait for evening, when footsteps would return, when the flow would reverse, when people would walk back toward their homes, carrying with them the result of another completed day. But for now, in this moment, the streets of Elmridge carried more than footsteps. They carried effort. They carried exchange. They carried the quiet, persistent movement of a country sustaining itself. And like every morning before it, this one asked for no recognition. It simply continued.
The factory stood at the far edge of Elmridge, where the pavement widened and the buildings became fewer. It was not designed to be beautiful. Its walls were made of concrete that had long ago lost its original color, settling into a permanent shade somewhere between gray and memory. The windows were tall but narrow, and many of them carried the faint marks of years that had passed without anyone noticing. From a distance, it looked still, but it was never completely still. Even during its quietest hours, when most of the workers had gone home and the parking lot was empty, something remained alive inside it. A single overhead light left on above a workstation, the low hum of a machine running a maintenance cycle, the slow pooling of metal that had been shaped hours earlier. It was a place that rested but never fully slept. Thomas Carter arrived at 6:51 a.m., as he had done on most mornings for nearly 2 decades. His car moved into the parking lot with familiarity, turning into a space he had used so often that he no longer thought about choosing it. He turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel. Around him, other cars were arriving. Each one carried a person who had made the decision, consciously or unconsciously, to continue. He stepped out and closed the door behind him. The air still carried the coolness of morning, but it would not remain that way for long. Soon the heat inside the factory would rise, created by machines and motion. He walked toward the entrance, his shoes striking the pavement with a quiet rhythm. Above the door, a metal sign displayed the company's name, Elmridge Components Manufacturing. The letters had once been painted a deep blue, but time had faded them. Thomas pushed the door open and stepped inside. The smell was the same as always, a mixture of oil and metal, and something that could not be named but belonged entirely to this place. The factory floor stretched outward, wide and open. Machines stood in rows, silent for now, waiting.
They did not appear powerful in their stillness, but they would be. Other workers entered behind him. Some nodded, some said nothing. Words were not necessary. Their presence was enough. Many of them had worked here for years. Some had worked here for decades. They had seen the factory in different states. They had seen it full. They had seen it nearly empty. There had been a time not long ago when the machines had stopped completely. It had happened slowly at first. Fewer orders, shorter shifts, conversations spoken in lower voices. No one had explained it fully. They did not need to. Workers understood these things without being told. They noticed when certain machines were no longer used. They noticed when certain lights remained off. They noticed when familiar faces stopped appearing. For a period of months, the factory had existed in uncertainty. It had not closed, but it had not fully lived. Thomas remembered those mornings clearly. He remembered walking through the same entrance and feeling the difference, even though the building itself had not changed. The silence had been heavier, not peaceful, but waiting. Some workers had left to find jobs elsewhere. Others had stayed, hoping that the machines would return to full motion, hoping that the factory would remember its purpose. And eventually it had. Orders had returned slowly. One machine started again, then another. The sound of production had re-entered the building, not suddenly, but gradually, like breathing returning after being held too long. Now, standing at his station, Thomas placed his hand on the surface of the machine in front of him. It was cool to the touch, but it would not remain that way. At exactly 7 a.m., the first machine started. Its sound was low at first, then steady. Another machine followed, then another. The factory filled with motion and sound, not chaotic, but organized. Each machine performed its task with precision. Each worker performed theirs. Metal was shaped, parts were assembled, products were created that would leave this town and become part of something larger. Most of the workers would never see where those parts ended up. They did not know the final form of what they helped create. They did not need to. Their role was here. Their role was continuation. Across the factory floor, Maria Gutierrez adjusted the settings on her station. She had started working here 12 years earlier after moving to Elm Ridge with her husband. At first, the work had felt unfamiliar. The machines had seemed complicated. Now they felt predictable. She knew their sounds. She knew when something was wrong simply by listening. She did not think of herself as part of something important. She thought of herself as someone doing her job. But her presence mattered in ways that were not immediately visible. Like everyone else here, she represented stability, survival, participation in a system that extended far beyond these walls. At 8:14 a.m., sunlight entered through the high windows, falling across the floor in long, quiet shapes. Dust moved slowly in the air, only visible when touched by light. The machines did not notice the sunlight. They continued their work without pause. Time inside the factory moved differently than outside. It was measured not in minutes, but in cycles, in completed units, in finished tasks. Break time arrived at 9:30 a.m. The machines stopped, and the sudden quiet felt larger than expected. Workers gathered in the break room, sitting at tables, drinking coffee from paper cups. They spoke about ordinary things, weather, family, television. They did not speak about the larger meaning of their work. They did not describe themselves as participants in history. They were simply people on a break. 10 minutes later, the machines started again, and the factory returned to life. Outside, the town continued its own routines. Cars passed, stores opened and closed, children sat in classrooms. But inside the factory, something essential was happening. Not dramatic, not visible to most, but essential. Each completed part represented more than its physical form. It represented employment, continuity, contribution. The factory did not exist in isolation. It existed as part of a network. Materials arrived, products left, money moved, lives were supported. The building itself remained unchanged, but its function connected it to places far beyond Elmridge. By afternoon, the rhythm of work had become complete. Workers moved without hesitation. Machines operated without interruption. The factory no longer carried the uncertainty it once had. It carried motion. It carried purpose. It carried the quiet evidence of recovery. No announcement marked this recovery. No celebration declared it. It existed only in continuation, in the simple fact that the machines were running again, that the workers had returned, that the factory, which had once stood in partial silence, now spoke again in the language of production. And like every factory across the country that had endured uncertainty and resumed its work, it represented something larger than itself. Not just industry, not just employment, but resilience. The kind that did not appear in headlines, the kind that existed in ordinary mornings, repeated until they formed the foundation of something lasting. By evening, the machines would stop again, the workers would leave, the building would grow quiet, but it would not sleep completely, because morning would come again, and with it, the sound of continuation.
In Elmridge, the kitchens were rarely silent for long. Even when no one spoke, there were sounds that filled the space. Coffee dripping into glass pots, chairs shifting against the floor, the quiet hum of refrigerators that had been running for years without interruption. These sounds formed a kind of background language, one that existed beneath words and carried its own quiet meaning. At 6:32 a.m., Margaret Carter stood at the stove in her small, familiar kitchen. The overhead light cast a soft yellow glow across the counter, illuminating the objects that had not moved in years. A ceramic bowl sat beside the sink. A folded dish towel rested near the edge of the counter. The clock on the wall ticked forward with steady indifference. She cracked 2 eggs into a pan and watched as the edges slowly turned white. The motion was ordinary, repeated so many times that it no longer required thought. Behind her, Thomas Carter sat at the table, his hands wrapped around a coffee cup. He stared at nothing in particular, his eyes resting somewhere between the present moment and whatever waited for him at the factory. Neither of them spoke at first. There was comfort in the silence. It was not empty. It was full of understanding that did not need words. Finally, Margaret placed the plate in front of him. "You'll be home at the usual time?" she asked. Thomas nodded. "Unless something changes." Something changes. The phrase held more meaning than either of them expressed. It carried the quiet awareness that stability was never fully guaranteed, that work continued, but always with the possibility of interruption. Margaret sat down across from him, holding her own cup of coffee. "Daniel called last night," she said. Thomas looked up. "How's he doing?" "He said classes are harder than he expected." Thomas nodded slowly. Their son, Daniel, had left Elmridge 2 years earlier to attend college in another state. His absence had changed the house in ways that were difficult to describe. His room remained mostly untouched, not because it needed to be preserved, but because neither of them had found a reason to change it. "He'll figure it out," Thomas said. Margaret nodded, though her expression remained thoughtful. They did not speak about their hopes directly. They did not describe their expectations in detail, but those hopes existed in the quiet space between their words. They existed in the fact that Daniel was somewhere else, building a future that would not look exactly like theirs. Across town, in another kitchen, Helen Morris sat alone at her table. Her kitchen was smaller than the Carters', but it held the same sense of permanence. The cabinets had been painted years ago, and the paint had begun to fade at the edges where hands had touched them most often. She poured herself a second cup of coffee and looked out the window. There had been a time when this kitchen held more people.
Her husband had sat across from her every morning reading the newspaper. Her daughter had rushed through, late for school, grabbing toast before running out the door. Now the chairs remained empty. Her daughter lived in another city, working in an office Helen had never seen. Their conversations happened over the phone now, carried across distance by invisible signals. Helen did not resent this change. She understood it. It was the way things moved. The future did not remain in the same place as the past. It moved forward, carried by decisions made in kitchens like this one. In another part of Elmridge, the Gutierrez family gathered around their table. Maria Gutierrez stood near the counter, packing a lunch into a small container. Her husband, Luis, sat with their daughter, Elena, who was finishing her breakfast before school. "You have your test today," Maria said gently. Elena nodded. "You studied?" "Yes." Luis smiled slightly. "You'll do fine." Elena looked down at the table, her fingers tracing the wood grain absent-mindedly. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" Luis asked, not because he expected a final answer, but because the question itself mattered. Elena hesitated. "I don't know," she said. Maria and Luis exchanged a brief glance. They understood that uncertainty. They had lived it themselves. They had come to Elmridge with no clear guarantees, only the belief that work and persistence would create something stable. Their presence in this kitchen was evidence of that belief. Maria said, "You have time." Elena nodded again. Outside, the morning continued its steady progression. Cars moved down the streets, school buses arrived and departed. But inside these kitchens, something quieter was taking place. The future was being imagined. Not in dramatic declarations, but in small conversations, in questions asked without pressure, in encouragement offered without certainty. These conversations did not appear in newspapers. They were not recorded, but they shaped decisions that would influence years, even decades to come. By 8:02 a.m., many of the kitchens in Elmridge had grown quieter again. Coffee cups sat empty, chairs were pushed back. People had left for work, for school, for responsibilities waiting beyond their front doors. The conversations had ended, but their meaning remained. It remained in the decisions that would follow, in the paths that would be chosen, in the futures that would slowly take shape. The kitchens themselves would wait. They would remain still until evening, when people returned and the cycle began again, when new conversations would take place, when new hopes would be spoken softly, not loudly, not with certainty, but with belief.
At 8:27 a.m., the hallways of Elmridge Elementary School filled with the sound of footsteps that were lighter and quicker than those heard anywhere else in town. Shoes moved across polished floors, some carefully, some without attention. Voices overlapped in uneven rhythms, rising and falling without coordination. Lockers opened and closed, papers shifted, backpacks were placed onto hooks with familiar carelessness. The building itself had stood for over 40 years. Its bricks had faded under decades of sun and winter, but its purpose had never changed. Every morning, it received children who arrived not fully aware of what they were entering. They came because they were expected to, because their parents told them to, because it was part of life. They did not come because they understood the future. Inside room 12, Margaret Ellis stood beside her desk, holding a sheet of paper with the day's lesson written across it. She had been teaching third grade for 26 years. Over that time, she had taught more students than she could easily remember. Some faces remained clear in her mind. Others had faded, blending into the larger memory of repetition. She did not think of herself as someone shaping history. She thought of herself as someone explaining multiplication. The students entered gradually, taking their seats without needing instruction. They had learned this routine early. Their movements reflected practice rather than thought. A boy named Kevin Turner sat near the window. He looked outside briefly, watching as a car passed on the street beyond the schoolyard.
His mind lingered there for a moment before returning to the room. He did not know that the skills he would learn here would follow him into places he could not yet imagine. He only knew that he was expected to listen. Margaret wrote numbers on the chalkboard. The chalk produced a dry, quiet sound as it moved across the surface. "Today," she said, "we're going to continue working on multiplication." Some students paid close attention, others struggled to maintain focus. This was normal. Learning rarely appeared dramatic while it was happening. It appeared slow, repetitive, uncertain. But within that repetition, something was forming. The ability to understand patterns, the ability to solve problems, the ability to think beyond immediate surroundings. These abilities would not reveal their importance immediately. They would remain invisible, waiting. Down the hall in room 18, a different kind of lesson was beginning. Robert Jenkins stood in front of a group of older students, holding a textbook that described the structure of the human body. He pointed to a diagram. "This is the heart," he said. The students looked at the image. Some of them listened with curiosity, some with obligation. Among them sat a girl named Elena Gutierrez. She watched carefully. She did not know why she found the subject interesting. She did not know that this interest would remain with her. She only knew that something about it held her attention. Robert spoke about how the heart moved blood through the body, how it worked continuously without rest. The students wrote notes in their notebooks. Their handwriting was uneven, their understanding incomplete, but the process had begun. Outside, the playground remained empty. The swings hung motionless, waiting for recess. Inside, the quiet work of preparation continued. In another classroom, students practiced reading aloud. Their voices moved slowly, sometimes stopping to correct mistakes. Reading was not easy at first. It required patience, effort. But once learned, it opened access to information that extended far beyond the classroom. Books held knowledge gathered across generations, knowledge that would pass through these students and into the future. At 9:42 a.m., a bell rang, marking the transition between lessons. The sound echoed through the hallways. Students stood, gathered their materials, and moved to new rooms. Each transition brought them into contact with different ideas, different skills, different possibilities. None of them understood the full significance of these movements. They did not think about the future industries they might enter. They did not imagine themselves as engineers, doctors, teachers, or leaders. They thought about the present moment, about finishing assignments, about waiting for lunch, about the simple passage of the day. In the school library, rows of books stood quietly on wooden shelves. Their covers displayed titles the students did not fully understand. Some books described history, some described science, some described ideas that had once seemed impossible. A boy named Daniel Reeves sat at a table, flipping through a book about machines. The images showed diagrams of engines and mechanical systems. He studied them without fully understanding their complexity, but the exposure mattered. It introduced him to the existence of possibilities beyond his current experience. Margaret believed in this process, even when its results were not visible. She understood that education did not produce immediate transformation, it produced gradual change. Students did not leave her classroom suddenly different. They left slightly more prepared, slightly more capable. These small changes accumulated over time, across years, across generations. At 11:58 a.m., the lunch bell rang. Students filled the cafeteria, carrying trays of food. Conversations resumed, louder now, less structured. They spoke about ordinary things, games, television shows, plans for the weekend. They did not speak about their future roles in society. They did not describe themselves as future contributors to national progress. They described themselves as children, and that was enough. Teachers sat at their own tables, observing quietly. They understood something the students did not. They understood that time would move forward, that these children would grow, that the lessons taught here would remain long after specific details were forgotten. In the afternoon, sunlight entered through the classroom windows, falling across desks where students worked on assignments. Some struggled, some succeeded easily. Each experience shaped their confidence, their persistence, their willingness to continue learning. School ended at 3:07 p.m. The final bell rang and students gathered their belongings. They left the building in groups, their voices carrying across the schoolyard. They did not look back. They did not think of the building as something that would influence their entire lives. To them, it was simply school, but its influence would remain. It would exist in their ability to read instructions, to calculate numbers, to understand systems, to communicate ideas. These abilities would travel with them into factories, offices, laboratories, and institutions not yet built. The school itself would remain. Its classrooms would fill again the next morning, with new students, with new futures waiting quietly beneath the surface. And like thousands of schools across the country, it would continue its work without recognition, preparing children not for a specific world, but for an unknown one. A world they would help create without realizing it had begun here. By mid-morning, the town of Elm Ridge had fully entered its rhythm. The early stillness had disappeared, replaced by a quiet but constant motion that continued without interruption. From a distance, nothing about the town appeared extraordinary. Its buildings stood where they always had. Its streets carried cars at predictable intervals. Its sidewalks held people moving toward familiar destinations. Yet beneath this ordinary surface existed something essential. The workers of Elm Ridge had begun their day. They did not arrive together. They arrived one by one, at different times, through different doors. Their roles were varied, their responsibilities specific, and their presence so familiar that it often went unnoticed. But without them, nothing would have functioned. At 9:16 a.m., inside a narrow garage near the edge of town, Daniel Reeves wiped his hands on a cloth already darkened by years of use. He stood beside the open hood of a delivery van, examining the engine with focused patience. The van belonged to a local shipping company. Its driver had noticed a sound that did not belong. Daniel listened carefully. He did not rely on machines to tell him what was wrong. He relied on experience. He reached into the engine compartment and adjusted a component that most people would not recognize. His movements were precise, guided by understanding developed over years of repetition. To the driver, Daniel's work meant the difference between delay and continuation. To Daniel, it was simply his job. He did not think about how many deliveries depended on vehicles like this one. He did not think about how those deliveries connected businesses across towns and states. He thought about solving the problem in front of him. Outside the garage, a postal truck passed slowly, its driver moving from one stop to the next. Inside the truck, letters and packages were arranged in careful order. The driver, a woman named Susan Wilkes, followed the same route every weekday. She knew which houses received frequent mail and which did not. She knew which residents waited for letters and which rarely checked their mailboxes. She did not read the envelopes. She did not know their contents, but she carried them faithfully. Each letter represented communication, opportunity, obligation, connection. Her role ensured that these things reached their destination. She did not consider herself important, but her absence would have been immediately noticed. At the grocery store, Samuel Parker stood behind the register, scanning items as customers placed them on the counter. The process was simple. Each item passed across the scanner. Each total appeared on the screen. Each transaction ended with an exchange of money and a brief acknowledgement. "Thank you," he said. "Have a good day." The words were repeated dozens of times. They did not lose their meaning. They reinforced the quiet agreement between people participating in a shared system. Samuel's work ensured that food moved from suppliers to homes, that shelves remained stocked, that daily life continued without interruption. Across town, Patricia Klein sat at her desk inside the bank. Papers were arranged neatly in front of her. Numbers filled the forms she reviewed. Her work required attention to detail, accuracy, consistency. She processed transactions that represented decisions made by others, loans, savings, payments. Each number reflected movement within the larger economy. She did not see the factories where the money originated. She did not see the homes where it would be used, but her role connected those places. At 9:42 a.m., a delivery driver named Marcus Hill stepped out of his truck carrying a package toward the entrance of an office building. The package was not large. It did not appear significant, but it contained parts needed for equipment that would soon be used. Marcus walked with steady purpose. He had driven hundreds of miles that week. He did not remember every package. He remembered the route, the motion, the continuation. Elsewhere, Maria Gutierrez stood at her station in the factory, inspecting finished components before placing them into containers for shipment. Her work required concentration. A single overlooked defect could cause problems later. She examined each piece carefully. Her attention ensured reliability. She did not know where the components would go. She did not know who would use them, but she knew her role was necessary. These workers shared something deeper than their individual responsibilities. They shared invisibility. Not literal invisibility, but the kind that comes from familiarity. Their work was seen but not recognized as extraordinary. It was expected, dependable, constant. A mechanic repairing engines, a clerk processing transactions, a driver delivering packages. Each role appeared small when viewed alone, but together they formed the structure of continuation. At 11:15 a.m., a utility worker named Frank Delaney stood beside an electrical panel, checking its connections. His work ensured that power flowed without interruption. Lights remained on because of him. Machines continued operating because of him. Homes remained comfortable because of him. Most people never thought about the electrical systems that supported their lives. They only noticed when those systems failed. Frank's success existed in prevention, in ensuring that failure did not occur. He did not rely on recognition for this. He did not expect it. He took quiet satisfaction in the absence of problems. At midday, many of these workers paused briefly. They sat in break rooms, in parked vehicles, at small tables. They ate meals brought from home or purchased nearby. They rested. They spoke of ordinary things, weather, family, plans for the weekend. They did not describe themselves as essential. They described themselves as tired, as busy, as continuing. After their break, they returned to work. The mechanic resumed his repairs. The driver resumed her route. The clerk resumed her calculations. The factory worker resumed her inspection. Each action contributed to something larger than any one person could fully see. The town continued functioning because of them. The country continued functioning by millions like them. Not leaders, not public figures, but workers. People whose names would not appear in history books. People whose contributions would not be individually recorded. Yet their impact existed everywhere, in functioning vehicles, in delivered goods, in operating machines, in stable systems. By late afternoon, some workers began to finish their shifts. Tools were returned to their places. Machines were turned off. Papers were organized. Vehicles were parked. The visible motion slowed, but the effect of their work remained. It remained in the repaired engine that would start without hesitation, in the delivered package waiting to be opened, in the processed transaction recorded permanently, in the powered building standing in quiet readiness. These outcomes appeared ordinary, but they represented success. Not dramatic success, but sustained success, the kind that allowed life to continue predictably. As the sun began its slow descent, the workers left their workplaces and returned to their homes. Their roles paused, but their importance did not disappear. It remained embedded in the systems they supported.
It remained in the continuation of ordinary life. They did not carry visible symbols of their importance. They carried something quieter: responsibility, reliability, presence. They carried invisible importance, and through their daily work, repeated without recognition, they sustained the structure of a nation that depended entirely on their continuation.
No one in Elm Ridge could point to the exact moment when the town began to change. There had been no ceremony, no public declaration, no single morning when residents woke up and realized that something fundamental had shifted. Instead, the change arrived quietly, in pieces so small that they were almost impossible to measure while they were happening. At first, it appeared at the edge of town. A section of land that had remained empty for years was cleared. The grass disappeared. Wooden stakes were placed into the ground at careful intervals. A sign was installed near the roadside, displaying the name of a construction company few people recognized. For weeks, nothing else happened. People drove past the empty land without thinking about it. It remained only a possibility. Then, one morning, a truck arrived carrying materials. Another followed. Workers stepped out, wearing boots that pressed into the soft soil. They did not speak loudly. They did not attract attention. They began their work with quiet efficiency, measuring distances, marking boundaries. The land, which had existed without purpose, was beginning to receive one. Thomas Carter noticed the construction site during his drive to the factory. He saw it the way he saw many things, with brief awareness, but without deeper consideration. It existed at the edge of his routine, visible but not central. He did not imagine how it would alter the town. He simply drove past. Weeks passed. The wooden frame of a building emerged slowly from the ground. At first, it looked fragile, like something temporary, but as more materials were added, its structure became clear. It was permanent. It would remain long after the workers left. Elsewhere in Elm Ridge, smaller changes occurred. A storefront that had remained empty for nearly a year was suddenly occupied again. Paper was removed from the windows, lights were turned on, shelves were installed. A new business had arrived. Its presence did not attract crowds immediately. People entered cautiously, uncertain of what they would find. Some made purchases, some only looked. The business became part of the town gradually, not through announcement, but through repetition. Each day it opened its doors. Each day it remained. Maria Gutierrez noticed another change in her neighborhood. A house that had stood empty for months now showed signs of life. A car appeared in the driveway. Lights were visible through the windows at night. New residents had arrived. She saw them once, briefly, as they carried boxes inside. They did not speak, they did not introduce themselves, but their presence altered the neighborhood. It increased its population by a small, measurable amount. This was how cities expanded, not through sudden transformation, but through accumulation. At the local bank, Patricia Klein processed paperwork for individuals she had never met. Applications for home loans, requests to open new accounts, documents that represented decisions to remain, to invest, to build lives in this place. Each form passed through her hands quietly. Each one represented commitment, people choosing to stay or choosing to arrive. At the construction site, the building continued to rise. Walls were installed, windows were fitted into place, electrical wiring was hidden behind surfaces that would soon appear complete. The workers did not speak about the future occupants. They focused on the present task. Their work ensured that the building would stand. Months later, a sign appeared outside the finished structure. It identified the building as an office space. Soon, cars began to appear in its parking lot. Employees entered and exited each day. The building had become part of the town's daily function. Few people remembered when it had not existed. This was the nature of gradual change. It erased its own beginnings.
At Elm Ridge Elementary School, enrollment increased slightly. One new student in a classroom, then another the following year. Teachers adjusted without comment. Desks were rearranged. Names were added to attendance lists. These changes did not feel dramatic, but they reflected movement, families arriving, staying, becoming part of the community. The grocery store expanded its inventory. New products appeared on shelves that had once held fewer options. Samuel Parker did not announce these additions, he simply made space for them. Customers adjusted their habits without noticing. They selected from the new options as if they had always been there. Even the streets began to change. Traffic increased slightly, not enough to create congestion, but enough to alter the rhythm of movement. Cars appeared more frequently at intersections. Parking spaces filled more quickly. The town's pace adjusted in response. At the edge of Elm Ridge, another construction site appeared, then another, each small on its own, but together they formed a pattern. Growth, not explosive, not dramatic, but continuous. The people who lived in Elm Ridge did not describe these changes as expansion. They described them as normal, as expected, as continuation. Children grew older, families moved, businesses opened and closed. The town adapted without resistance, without announcement, without needing permission. Years passed, and the accumulation became visible only in retrospect. More buildings existed than before. More people lived here. More activity filled the streets. But no single moment could be identified as the turning point. The city had expanded without declaration, without acknowledgement, without spectacle. Thomas Carter noticed the difference only when he tried to remember what had once stood where the new buildings now existed. His memory struggled to recreate the empty spaces. They had been replaced completely, their absence forgotten. Maria Gutierrez saw it in the increased number of students at the school. Patricia Klein saw it in the growing number of financial records. Samuel Parker saw it in the steady flow of customers. Each observation reflected the same truth. The city was becoming something larger, not suddenly, but inevitably. This was how cities grew across the country, through quiet decisions made by individuals, through construction that appeared ordinary, through migration that occurred without ceremony. No headlines described these changes, no national attention focused on them, but they mattered because they represented belief, belief in stability, belief in opportunity, belief in the future. By evening, the lights in the new buildings glowed alongside those that had existed for decades. They did not appear new anymore. They appeared necessary. They had been absorbed into the identity of the town. The expansion had completed itself without anyone fully noticing. And it would continue, not through sudden transformation, but through the same quiet process. One building, one family, one decision at a time.
By the time the sun began its slow descent behind the trees west of Elm Ridge, the town had already completed most of what it was going to do that day. The noise that had defined the hours of morning and afternoon, the sound of engines, machines, footsteps, and voices began to fade, not suddenly, but in stages so gradual that no one could identify the exact moment when work ended and evening began. At 5:02 p.m., Thomas Carter stood beside his workstation in the factory, watching as the machine in front of him completed its final cycle. The metal component it had shaped slid into place with the same quiet precision it had demonstrated all day. There was no difference between this final piece and the hundreds that had come before it. It did not mark itself as the last. Thomas reached forward and turned off the machine. The sound disappeared instantly, leaving behind a silence that felt larger than expected. Around him, other machines were shutting down, one by one, each silence layered over the next. The factory, which had been alive with motion and sound only minutes earlier, began returning to stillness. Workers removed their gloves, they wiped their hands, they gathered their belongings. No one applauded. No one announced that progress had been made. They simply prepared to leave. Outside, the parking lot filled with movement again, but this time the motion was directed away from work rather than toward it. Engines started, headlights flickered on, cars reversed from their spaces and joined the slow procession toward the road. Thomas sat behind the wheel of his car and waited as another vehicle passed in front of him. He did not feel dramatic satisfaction. He did not feel transformation. He felt completion, the kind that did not demand recognition, the kind that existed quietly. As he drove through town, he saw others doing the same. Cars moved toward neighborhoods, toward driveways, toward homes that waited without expectation. The streets, which had carried urgency in the morning, now carried release. At 5:36 p.m., Maria Gutierrez stepped through the front door of her house. The air inside was cooler, still holding the calm of absence. She placed her keys on the small table near the door and paused briefly. The house did not ask her what she had accomplished. It did not measure her productivity. It simply received her. In the kitchen, she began preparing dinner. The movements were familiar. She washed vegetables. She placed a pan on the stove. She listened to the quiet sounds of cooking. These sounds replaced the mechanical rhythm of the factory. They erased it, not completely, but enough. In another part of town, Daniel Reeves locked the door of the garage where he worked. The tools inside remained where he had left them, waiting for morning. He stepped outside and inhaled deeply, aware of the air in evening in a way he had not been aware of the air inside the garage. Work had occupied his attention fully. Evening allowed it to release him. He walked to his car and drove home, passing buildings that were already growing quiet. At 5:12 p.m., lights appeared in windows of houses across Elmridge. Each light marked a return. Each light marked presence. Inside those homes, workers sat down. Some ate dinner with their families. Others ate alone. Some spoke about their day in brief summaries. Others did not speak about it at all. The details of their labor remained unspoken, not because they were unimportant, but because they did not require retelling. They had been completed. Margaret Carter placed a plate in front of Thomas as he sat at the kitchen table. "How was work?" she asked. "Fine," he said. The word contained an entire day's worth of effort. It did not need expansion. After dinner, he stood at the sink, washing dishes slowly. The act required little thought. His hands moved automatically. Outside, the sky darkened. The transition from day to night continued without interruption. At 7:03 p.m., the town existed in a different state than it had that morning. The urgency was gone. The expectations were gone. In their place existed rest. Not complete rest, but sufficient rest. On a quiet street near the center of town, Helen Morris sat in her living room listening to the faint sound of a television. She was not watching it closely. The images moved across the screen without demanding her attention. Her day had been ordinary. She had completed small tasks. She had spoken to few people. She did not measure the day by its productivity. She measured it by its completion. Across town, Patricia Klein sat near her apartment window reading a book. Her work at the bank required careful attention, constant accuracy. Reading allowed her mind to move differently, more freely. The numbers and forms she had processed no longer occupied her thoughts. Evening created distance between effort and awareness. At 8:17 p.m., the streets of Elmridge had grown quiet again. Fewer cars passed. Fewer voices carried through the air. The town did not appear productive in this state. It appeared still. But this stillness was not the absence of progress. It was its conclusion. Progress did not end with celebration. It ended with rest, with workers returning to places where their identities were not defined by their labor, places where they existed simply as themselves, fathers, mothers, neighbors, individuals. The factory stood silent now. Its machines rested. Its lights were turned off. It did not appear powerful in this state, but its silence represented completion, not failure. It would resume its work in the morning, like everything else. By 9:42 p.m., most of the lights in Elmridge were turned off. Houses returned to darkness. Streets returned to stillness. The town resembled its earliest morning state, but it was not the same. The day had passed through it. Work had been completed. Progress had occurred, not visibly, not dramatically, but undeniably. And now it had been erased by evening. Not erased in its effect, but erased in its noise, leaving behind only quiet, only rest, only the certainty that morning would come again, and with it the continuation of everything that had paused. Because progress did not demand recognition, it demanded repetition, and repetition required rest. So the evening did what it had always done. It erased the noise and prepared the town to begin again. The television in Thomas Carter's living room did not announce its importance. It sat in the corner of the room, resting on a wooden stand that had been purchased specifically to hold it. Its surface reflected faint images of the room itself, the outline of the sofa, the lamp beside the wall, the quiet presence of ordinary life. When it was turned off, it appeared almost unnecessary, like an object that existed without urgency. But when it was turned on, it connected the house to places far beyond Elmridge. On a cool evening in early autumn, Thomas sat down in his usual chair at 7:58 p.m., holding a cup of coffee that had already begun to cool. Margaret sat on the sofa, folding laundry slowly, her hands moving with familiar precision. The room was quiet, except for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. At exactly 8 p.m., Thomas reached forward and pressed the power button. The television responded immediately. A faint sound emerged first, followed by light. The screen flickered briefly before forming a stable image. A man in a suit appeared, seated behind a desk in a studio hundreds of miles away. "Good evening," the man said calmly. His voice filled the room. He did not know Thomas Carter. He did not know Margaret Carter, but he spoke to them as if he did. Across Elmridge, in houses arranged along quiet streets, the same moment was occurring. Other televisions turned on. Other families sat down. Other rooms filled with the same voice. None of these people were together physically, but they were experiencing the same moment simultaneously. This had not always been possible. Years earlier, information traveled slowly. Newspapers arrived in newspapers printed overnight. Events occurred far away and remained distant, separated by time and geography. Now, those distances had been reduced. Not completely, but enough. In her small house near the center of town, Helen Morris sat alone in her living room, watching the same broadcast. The light from the television illuminated her face softly. She did not move. She did not speak. She listened. The news described events occurring in cities she had never visited, economic changes, political decisions, scientific developments. These things did not alter her immediate surroundings. Her house remained still, her street remained quiet, but her awareness expanded. She understood that the town she lived in existed as part of something larger. The television made this understanding possible. At 8:17 p.m., the broadcast shifted. The man behind the desk was replaced by images of another place, crowded streets in a distant city, filled with people Helen would never meet. They moved across the screen without awareness of being observed. Yet they were observed, in Elmridge, in thousands of towns like it. Inside the Gutierrez home, Elena sat cross-legged on the floor, watching carefully. She did not fully understand everything she saw. Some of the words were unfamiliar. Some of the places meant nothing to her. But she watched anyway. The television introduced her to the existence of a wider world. It showed her that life existed beyond her school, beyond her neighborhood, beyond the boundaries of her daily experience. Her parents watched with her. They did not explain everything. They did not need to. The exposure itself mattered. In another house across town, Samuel Parker sat in his chair watching a different program. A drama unfolded on the screen, showing characters whose lives were more complicated than his own. They faced challenges. They made decisions. They lived in environments more dramatic than Elmridge. Samuel understood that it was fiction, but it still affected him. It gave shape to ideas about how people lived elsewhere. It created shared references that extended beyond his own experience. The next morning, customers would enter his store and speak about the same program. "Did you see it last night?" they would ask. He would nod. They would share observations. The television created common ground between people who might otherwise have had little to discuss. At 9:03 p.m., Thomas Carter leaned back in his chair as the program shifted again. Now it showed images of technological progress, machines being developed, systems being tested. He watched without fully understanding the technical details, but he understood the implication. The country was changing, advancing, moving forward. He did not participate directly in those developments, but he witnessed them. The television allowed him to see progress that existed beyond his factory, beyond his town. It connected his ordinary life to a larger national story. Margaret finished folding the laundry and sat beside him. Neither of them spoke. They watched together. This shared silence was not empty. It was collective attention. Across the country, millions of others were doing the same, sitting in living rooms, watching the same images, hearing the same voices, forming a shared awareness. At 9:41 p.m., the program ended. The screen shifted to another broadcast, lighter in tone. Music played softly. Thomas did not change the channel immediately. He allowed the television to continue. Its presence filled the room in a way that felt familiar, comforting, reliable. Elsewhere in Elmridge, televisions remained on in dozens of homes. Some people watched carefully. Others allowed the sound to exist in the background, a quiet companion to their evening routines. Children absorbed ideas without realizing it. Adults expanded their understanding without intending to. The television did not demand effort. It delivered information effortlessly. It entered homes without requiring people to leave them. It reshaped awareness without announcing itself. At 10:12 p.m., Patricia Klein sat on her sofa watching a documentary about scientific research. Images of laboratories appeared on the screen. Men and women worked with equipment she did not recognize. She watched with quiet interest. She had never seen such places in person, but now they existed in her awareness. The television extended her perception. It had made distant realities visible. This visibility mattered, not because it changed her immediately, but because it expanded what she believed was possible. In houses across Elmridge, the same process occurred, not dramatically, not suddenly, but continuously, night after night, broadcast after broadcast. The television shaped understanding. It shaped expectations. It shaped identity. People began to see themselves not only as residents of Elmridge, but as participants in a larger national experience. They shared the same information, the same stories, the same moments, even when separated by distance. At 9:47 p.m., Thomas finally turned off the television. The screen went dark. The room returned to silence. But the silence was different now. It contained what he had seen, what he had learned, what he had experienced indirectly. He stood and turned off the lamp. The house settled into stillness. Outside, the town rested. Inside its homes, televisions sat quietly, their screens dark, their voices silent. They appeared inactive, but their influence remained. It existed in conversations that would occur the next day, in ideas that would remain in people's minds, in the gradual formation of shared culture. The television did not change the town overnight. It did not transform lives instantly. It worked slowly, quietly, night after night, connecting millions of people who would never meet, allowing them to witness the same events, to share the same awareness, to exist not only as individuals, but as part of something larger. And it did all of this without announcement, without demanding recognition. It simply turned on, and in doing so, it brought the world into the living room, quietly.
The mornings in Elm Ridge had always begun predictably. Yet by the mid-1980s, something beneath that predictability had shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, the sort of change that did not announce itself with fanfare or headlines, but rather insinuated itself quietly into daily life. People noticed it, or at least they sensed it, though few could put words to what it was. Margaret Carter folded the laundry she had washed the night before, placing each item neatly on the counter. Her hands moved automatically, but her mind wandered. She noticed small things in the town she had once taken for granted. The grocery store had a new section of imported foods she had never seen before. The library offered new programs that catered not only to children, but also to adults. Her neighbors' children were choosing careers that her parents would never have imagined. Margaret felt a subtle tension in the air, not unpleasant, but noticeable. It was the sense of potential, possibilities arriving quietly, embedded in everyday life. The world outside Elm Ridge was growing faster than the town could articulate, and she felt the tug of it in small ways, like a draft slipping under the door. Across town, Thomas Carter arrived at the factory early as usual. Machines hummed to life, carrying the familiar rhythm of industry. Yet Thomas noticed differences he hadn't seen before. Some workers arrived with newer skills, having completed training programs or courses that the company had only recently introduced. Certain machines operated faster now, guided by technological improvements that seemed minor on the surface, but they demanded adjustments, attention, and knowledge he hadn't needed before. Thomas could feel the shift in expectations. Workers were no longer just required to perform repetitive tasks. They were asked to understand, to adapt, to innovate in small ways. The changes did not feel monumental in the moment, but collectively they marked a transformation. The factory floor was evolving, just as the society around it was, and yet no one spoke about it directly. Meanwhile, at Elm Ridge Elementary School, children were being introduced to concepts their parents had not encountered until college, or perhaps not at all. Coding exercises, science projects, discussions about global issues. These were not typical lessons of previous generations. Teachers encouraged curiosity in new ways, prompting students to think critically, to question patterns, and to envision outcomes beyond their immediate experience. Margaret often walked past the school in the evenings, observing these young learners leaving classrooms, backpacks heavy with knowledge she could not always interpret. She realized that these children would enter the world differently than she had, equipped with skills, ideas, and opportunities that were unspoken shifts in society's direction. In the same vein, the town's workplaces reflected similar undercurrents. Maria Gutierrez, inspecting components on her factory line, noticed that some co-workers had begun taking initiative in ways that had previously been unnecessary.
They offered solutions to problems before being asked. They experimented quietly, optimizing processes that had once been rigid. Maria could sense the small redefinition of roles. Workers were becoming participants in decision-making processes rather than mere executors. She felt a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. What did it mean for the factory, for their future? She could not articulate it. These changes were not always positive in their clarity. Samuel Parker, at the grocery store, observed shifts in his customer base. People now expected more variety, fresher products, and different services. Their tastes had expanded, influenced by advertisements, imported goods, television programming, and new societal standards. Samuel did not dislike the change, but he felt its weight. What had once sufficed, the same shelves stocked with the same items for years, was no longer enough. The culture surrounding commerce had evolved subtly, and Samuel's work required adaptation. Even in the homes of the town, cultural shifts were evident in ways that people could not name. Televisions introduced new ideas, showing lifestyles and expectations that challenged long-held assumptions. Margaret and Thomas sometimes watched programs together and discussed them quietly, often leaving conversations unfinished because neither could fully articulate the impact. New music, movies, and media highlighted changing social norms, altering what young people thought was possible, acceptable, or desirable. At the local library, patrons noticed similar undercurrents. Books on feminism, technology, psychology, and global awareness arrived on the shelves, sometimes quietly, often without fanfare. Readers borrowed them cautiously at first, then with curiosity. They engaged with ideas that challenged conventional wisdom, slowly reshaping their understanding of the world and their place within it. Evenings in the town emphasized the subtlety of these transformations. Houses grew quiet after the workday, but conversations at dinner tables often revolved around questions that had never been asked in previous generations. What do you want to do after college? Have you considered moving to a city for work? How can we improve this process at the factory? These discussions were gentle, ordinary, yet they hinted at the evolving expectations and new possibilities now threaded through the community. Children, like Elena Gutierrez, absorbed these shifts intuitively. She did not always understand the implications of her studies or the lessons she absorbed through television, books, and conversations, but the patterns influenced her thinking. She began to imagine futures that her parents could not have anticipated, goals that were possible precisely because the society around her had shifted in small, unspoken ways. The workers themselves also felt the tension of change without naming it. Mechanics, clerks, drivers, teachers, and factory employees were all participating in a quiet evolution of labor. They noticed that proficiency alone was no longer enough. Adaptability, problem-solving, and forward thinking had become expected, even if unspoken. Many felt uncertain about these expectations, yet they adapted out of necessity. Margaret walked through town one afternoon and noticed the construction of a new business complex. She watched workers lifting beams and installing glass panes. The structure would house offices, shops, and services that would change the town subtly over time. The changes were not dramatic. They did not appear in headlines, but they reshaped the opportunities and rhythms of daily life. Even the cultural practices of the town reflected these quiet shifts. People were less constrained by traditional roles, more open to mobility, and more aware of ideas and events beyond Elmridge. Teenagers experimented with careers, technology, and social ideas that had never been discussed when Margaret and Thomas were young. Parents observed with a mixture of pride and unease, sensing that the world had expanded faster than words could describe. In evenings like these, as the town settled into quiet and routine, Margaret, Thomas, and their neighbors would feel the weight of these changes without fully naming them. They were not catastrophic shifts, but the cumulative effect of incremental adaptation. It existed in the evolving expectations of work, in the education of children, in the media, and in the gradual restructuring of daily life.
No one in Elmridge announced that the town, the people, or the culture were changing. No ceremony marked the transformation, but through ordinary experiences, school lessons, factory shifts, television programs, family discussions, and new businesses, society had altered quietly, shaping the lives of residents in ways they could sense but could not articulate. By nighttime, the residents rested, reflecting vaguely on what had occurred during the day. They did not consider it historic, yet the day's events contributed to a continuum of social evolution. Over months and years, the accumulation of these small, nameless changes would manifest in visible outcomes: career paths pursued, educational achievements, business growth, and cultural awareness. These shifts remained subtle, embedded in routine, unnoticed by those living them, and yet they formed the foundation of a new reality, one that embraced opportunity, flexibility, and transformation without anyone needing to name it aloud. Elmridge, like countless other towns across the country, had evolved quietly in ways that mattered profoundly, even if they were invisible. Its residents felt it in instinct, in expectation, in adaptation. They were part of a living society in motion, participating in changes that would ripple through generations, shaping the culture and identity of the nation without ever requiring explicit acknowledgement. Even if they could not name these changes, they experienced them, adapted to them, and carried them forward, quietly, unassumingly, and irrevocably.